Okay, I think we're ready to go. Thank you all for coming to this conference. I'm excited to present some community research I've been doing for the last 3 years. I think the research fits with the theme of this conference, but I want to acknowledge right at the beginning, I'm an accidental community researcher. I was a basic researcher for 30 years. And then the COVID-19 pandemic happened, and then all other kinds of things happened, and suddenly I was a community researcher. So basically what happened is I'm a motivation researcher. I've been at McGill for 33 years. I have a human motivation lab. I do studies mostly with school children and university students, and I focus on motivational questions relevant to education. I tend to be a quiet, introverted person, so I didn't do a lot of applied outreaching kind of work. But then the pandemic happened, and I was flustered. First, I was afraid I would lose my job. Then I was afraid that society as we know it would end. And once I recovered from that, I said, okay, I'm going to try to be different for the next year or 2 or 3, however long the pandemic takes. And I'm going to say yes to every invitation I receive, every collaboration I receive. And what I realize is a lot of people ask me to give talks. And what they ask me to talk about is how to stay motivated and how to maintain our well-being during the pandemic. And so I started giving some talks, and then I had a former student who heard a talk, and she was working at the Black Community Resource Center, which is a really important community organization for Black people in Quebec. It serves both the Anglophone Black community and the Francophone, but it's especially important for the Anglophone Black community. And I was invited to maybe give a talk to the young adults in the Black community about staying motivated during the pandemic. And I already knew that the Black community had been hit very hard by the pandemic, and that Black young adults were reporting very high levels of depression and anxiety and distress. So I thought, yeah, I could do that. But then it actually became an opportunity to collaborate and to do some research together. And the basic idea was, at first, was just to track how bad things were for Black young adults in both the English and French-speaking Black communities. My understanding is about 15% of the Black people in Quebec are Anglophones, 85% are Francophones. The vast majority live in urban settings. But so probably from June 2020 until now, I've been doing surveys where the ideas for the surveys are generated in collaboration with the researchers at the Black Community Resource Center and with the organizers there. So I'll review some of that. And I call it a psychosocial checkup. 3 years in, I never imagined we'd be doing this work for 3 years, but I think we'll be continuing. So I mentioned already 30 years basic motivation researcher. I was very fortunate. Early in my career, I happened to work with 2 professors who were beginning to develop a motivation theory. And I thought it was a very positive, optimistic, humanistic theory called self-determination theory. And over the course of my adult life, it's grown to be the largest, probably most influential empirical theory of motivation. And I think many of you would be drawn to this theory because it suggests that growth, development is a natural process for almost all of us, but it depends on having certain kinds of experiences. What we need in our everyday lives and what we need in various settings is to feel autonomous, which means to feel like we make a difference. We can act on the world. We can impact what happens to us. There's a second basic need called relatedness, which means that we need to feel like there are others who care about us and who we care about. And the third basic need is competence, to feel like we can do things well, or if we can't do things well, at least we can learn to do them better. So there's autonomy, relatedness, and competence. The theory suggests these are fundamental basic human needs. And the trajectory or the arc of our lives will depend on whether we are having these needs satisfied or whether they're being thwarted or restricted. So with the pandemic, the theory that I work with would suggest that, we were likely to struggle because during the pandemic, we didn't feel very autonomous, that we were very restricted in what we could do. Some people weren't even able to pursue their interests because so many things were closed down. One of the really sad things about the pandemic is we had to isolate and social distance. And the way humans usually deal with emergencies is by affiliating and helping each other. And we weren't able to do that. Like older people were separated from their grandchildren and their children. And competence, a lot of us couldn't work like we usually do. So I suspected that most of us would take a hit because of the pandemic because we were no longer feeling as autonomous, connected, or competent. Okay, so I'm going to talk about the research I've been doing with the Black Community Resource Center, but then Régine Débrosse, who's a professor of social work at McGill University, will talk about her work with youth in Montreal regarding educational aspirations and how those were affected by the pandemic. And then Frank Kachanoff, a young colleague, but who's really a distinguished theoretical and applied researcher in the area of intergroup relations, will talk. And he'll focus a bit more on the relevance of this kind of work to the context of English-speaking people in Quebec. Okay. Now, I have three guiding principles in the work I've been doing regarding the pandemic and its impact on Black adults in Quebec. And that is, number one, COVID-19, even though it's called a pandemic, didn't affect all groups equally. It didn't affect everyone equally. So you know that older people were more affected, more threatened, but there's very good evidence. Oh, the other thing I was upset to learn is that Quebec was the epicenter of the COVID-19 pandemic, so that there were more infections, more deaths in Quebec than all the other provinces combined in the first year of the pandemic. And the very first, the other thing that emerged very quickly is that Black communities were very heavily impacted. So they had the highest rates of infections, the highest death rates, a lot of displacement in terms of work. Black communities tend to be more densely populated. There's multiple generations, and a lot of Black adults work in what were categorized as essential occupations. Now, the other thing that, the other guiding principle is that it wasn't just the pandemic. Other things happened and other things continue to happen. For example, Bill 96 being introduced, that's another important political event that adds on to some of the adjustments that people have had to make since the pandemic. But the one that I thought was especially important, because I was trying to collaborate with the Black Community Resource Center, was the emergence of the Black Lives Matters movement in late May in 2020. Now, the final point that I'll make is that we mostly use surveys to measure how people are feeling about their own lives. But one of the things we realized is that when we were surveying the Black community, it was important not only to ask, how do you feel in terms of your connection to others, in terms of your well-being, but also how do you feel your group is doing? How do you feel your community is doing? And quite often there's a disjunction where we think we're doing better than other people in a group that we identify with. But one of the things we found in our research is that for Black adults, how they feel their group was managing during the pandemic was importantly related to how they were doing as well. More so, I think, than those of us who are not part of more marginalized groups or groups that are striving for more acknowledgement and more acceptance. Okay, so I'll go through the timeline. I'm sorry to remind you of all of the ups and downs of the pandemic, but so it arrived February 27th. I think it's been categorized as the worst public health disaster in a century, or since the last pandemic. May 31st was the first BLM protest in Montreal. That was just a week after George Floyd was killed by policemen in Minneapolis. My guess is most of you were amazed at how fast and how powerful the reaction was to George Floyd's killing. And it was really striking. The Black Lives Matter movement seemed to unite people of color and white people as well. And it really seemed something different was happening. Now, what was interesting, though, is that we were still technically supposed to be in isolation, but I think the Black Lives Matter movement served to energize, especially the Black community, to come out, to join with others, and to protest. December 14th was V-Day, or the day the vaccines were first administered. I got my vaccine like December 26th. I'm one of the privileged people. But what I think many of us were surprised at is that when the vaccines arrived, that didn't mean that our troubles were over. And in fact, there was a lot of hesitation about getting vaccines. And historically, Black populations have been hesitant about vaccines because of some negative experiences with vaccinations in the past. In the summer of 2021, I think many of us thought the pandemic might be over, but then that fall or late fall, the Omicron variant arrived. And that was a time when the pandemic hit home for me because I caught COVID, and many people I know caught COVID. And earlier, my sense was, oh, well, I could stay protected, but Omicron was very contagious, and it made a lot of us really worry. And then the most recent event was Bill 96. Okay. In terms of the theoretical background for this work, I told you about self-determination theory, but there's also another theory that we linked with it. It's called social identity theory. And it proposes that people define their sense of self partly by identifying with groups. This could be a racial group or a religious group. And these identities are most influential when you consider your membership in this group to be central to who you are. And in our surveys, we find that 97% of Black adults consider being Black a core feature of their identity. So they're especially likely not only to be considering how they're feeling and how they're doing, but also how the Black community is doing. Our research method is pretty simple. We use easy to complete surveys. We do it every 4 months. Sometimes we do it with the same sample so we could look at changes over time. I'll show you some of those results. They're very interesting. as we've been doing the studies, we've been expanding. We began with English-speaking Black young adults. Then we expanded to older English-speaking Black adults. Then we included French-speaking adults. And now we're going beyond the Black community to look at other communities. Okay, right when I first arrived, right when I began collaborating, the Black Community Resource Center was already doing a big project that they had planned for a couple of years. It was called the Quebec Black Community Survey, and it focused on self-judgments of physical and mental health. And there were also a lot of questions about access to doctors, nurses, access to information. And it was a well-done survey with 510 Black adults. And there was reason to expect that the English-speaking Black adults might have less access to healthcare because of language concerns. So, and what the results suggested is that, in fact, there was some evidence that the English-speaking Black community was significantly less likely to have a large number of health professionals working with them. They did say they were receiving less information about COVID-19, and they were more dissatisfied with their health care. When we tried to make sense of this, it seemed to be that what was mediating it was that the English-speaking Black community were reporting more experiences of discrimination, probably because they were a double minority rather than just being a single minority. Now, that was something that was ongoing before I came, but it suggested that there might be differences between the English-speaking and French-speaking Black communities. In most of research I'll tell you about, we haven't obtained any differences like that. That was only in the very first survey that was ongoing when I came. So what I was most interested in when I came was assessing Black young adults, but we quickly realized that we could not assess the well-being of Black young adults in relation to the pandemic without also asking about the Black Lives Matters movement. And my initial idea, and it seemed like a reasonable one, was that the net effect of the pandemic was to isolate and make people feel more passive because we were so limited in what we could do. And I thought that the Black Lives Matters movement might have an energizing effect, especially for young people, because there was this very just cause to fight against. We collected some narrative reports, and what we found actually was Black young adults were terribly upset and distressed by the George Floyd killing and the killings that followed, because for the next 3 months, every couple of weeks, there was another terrible case. So there was a lot of pain and anguish, but at another level, there was something energizing, and that getting involved in the Black Lives Matters movement seemed to help Black young adults emerge from the isolation and passivity of the pandemic. So, and one of the things we noticed is that as people became involved in the Black Lives Matters movement, their sense of how the Black community was doing began to change. So rather than feeling like the Black community was having its basic needs thwarted, there was a sense that the community was doing something positive and something active, and that there was hope. And this translated into improved well-being and improved adjustment. Here are some of the examples of the kinds of questions we used. So we did that throughout 2020, but then we wanted to continue in 2021, and we expanded our survey to include Black Canadians across all provinces. And here we were looking very directly into how did involvement in the Black Lives Matters movement relate to continuing adjustment and happiness over time. And we did find that the more actively people were involved, and this involves more than just going to the protests. It also involves being active online and doing things in the community. But there was a clear association between being actively involved in 2020, continuing in 2021, and reporting improving happiness and well-being. Now, something we didn't expect, but it came through clearly, was that in particular, it was Black women who were most likely to get heavily involved in the Black Lives Matters movement. And that was because they perceived racial justice as a more threatening and dangerous and important issue that had to be acted on. In other research, we've noted that the Black Lives Matters movement generally has had greater involvement from women, and that there are other movements where it seemed like women played the leading role. So this is the model we were able to confirm where, because of the perceived threat of racial injustice, Black women in particular were more motivated to involve themselves in a really serious way in the movement, and that this led to activism, and then the activism led to improved well-being. Okay, the next thing we looked at was vaccinations, and unfortunately in Quebec, like in the United States and like other places, the Black community was most resistant, most hesitant to become vaccinated. And there were campaigns. I was part of a multidisciplinary campaign to have open houses and open forums to encourage people to be vaccinated. But unfortunately, there is a level of distrust of health authorities. And one of the things we found in the open houses that it's not just historic. It's not going back to the Tuskegee experiments of the 1920s. It seems that most Black adults have had an experience where they've gone to a hospital or someone they know went to a hospital and they felt like they weren't treated in the same way as other people. So there's a sense of there's something systemic that's causing that's making it harder for them to get the health care they need. So unfortunately, that still seems like it's going to be a challenge moving forward. Now, the most interesting and surprising thing in all the research we did was we tracked people during the emergence of the Omicron variant. And I want to remind you that in the summer of 2021, most of us were beginning to forget about Omicron. We were feeling good about our lives. We thought our future was coming. But if you remember that Christmas or that holiday season, you were unable to see your relatives and kids because Omicron burst out and everyone got it. So this was, I think, particularly a challenge and a test of resilience of whether, we thought it was over, then we get hit hard, and then over the next few months, it diminishes again. We were able to track people from before to at the peak and to afterward. And we found a really interesting pattern. And in this one, we compared Black adults with Asian and white adults. And we compared them on happiness, which is basically, are you satisfied with your life? How are things going? And something that's called post-traumatic growth. And that's a measure that was developed because it seems that some people could take trauma and suffering and transform it in a way where they feel they're actually getting stronger, they're more connected with others, they believe more strongly in their faith, and they can endure. So there's two different measures of adjustment. One is the classic happiness. The other is, I'm adapting well, I'm enduring. And what we find is that on happiness, there was a clear pattern where the Black adults were reporting much lower levels. That was true in the summer. That was true when Omicron hit hard, but it stops being true 6 months later. So the Black adults catch up on their basic judgment of life satisfaction. Why they catch up, it turns out it has to do with post-traumatic growth. So that in the summer, and when the pandemic broke, when Omicron broke out, and then later, the Black adults were significantly higher, dramatically higher, in saying that they've grown and learned because of the pandemic. They've learned to manage better. They feel like they are more connected to faith and to religion. I'll show you some of the, I don't have the items there. Now, so as the Black adults, what we were able to show is that because the Black adults had interpreted and used their suffering to feel better about their growth and development, that's why they were able to get back to the same levels of happiness. And the other thing we were able to show was that the post-traumatic growth was in response to perceiving that things were very bad for the Black community and that they had to do something. Okay, the very last thing I'll mention is we did recently do a survey because, of course, Bill 96 is very threatening to English-speaking people in Quebec. I want to acknowledge that, there's language inequities for French-speaking people in the rest of Canada. But what we did find is that in the English-speaking Black community, they were very discouraged by the restrictions they imagine will result from Bill 96. And they're more uncertain about whether they and their children and families will be able to stay in Quebec going into the future. Okay, so my conclusion is that Black communities in Quebec were especially hit hard by the pandemic, but it wasn't just the pandemic. It was other events like the Black Lives Matters movement, and I worry that Bill 96 might be another thing that will be very difficult for especially the English-speaking Black community. The other problem is, I think Black Lives Matters united the English and French-speaking Black communities. They campaigned together. They worked beautifully together. Bill 96 divides the English and French-speaking Black community, and it's such a small community that it's worrisome if they get divided. We did find that age, gender, and language sometimes has effects. And we did find that collective identity is really important to the Black community, and it will be associated with their well-being and other kinds of things. I'll stop there and I'll let Régine talk. Thank you.
So good morning, everyone. My name is Régine Débrosse. I'm an assistant professor at McGill University, trained in psychology and now at the School of Social Work. I'm really excited to be with all of you today. It feels really great to have finally our research meetings back in person. It's really not the same on Zoom, not at all. So as part of my research, I've been working a lot with communities, particularly Black and immigrant and communities of color. And I'm especially interested in the way that young people, youth, view their racial and ethnic identities and how this impacts their well-being, but especially how it impacts their motivation. So I was really grateful to be invited to speak about this today, but also that a lot of the background that I could have presented to just give you a little bit of an idea of how our motivation works. Some layers about it have been already presented by Professor Koestner. But the other thing I want to share is also that as Professor Koestner was talking about, when we think about the pandemic, of course, this was a time where it was really, really tough for youth. And really tough for the Black community. So you can imagine that for Black youth, it was a particularly dire time, but it was also a time where it was really difficult to collect any data with them. They were really difficult to reach, which was part of the distress that was caused by the pandemic. So I want to acknowledge that I don't have as much data as I wish I had, but I'll still show you a few things that I have. So today, really, I will be talking about facing a pandemic while Black and about some of Black youth's experiences, particularly with COVID challenges and particularly in terms of their post-secondary transitions. So I've mentioned that I'm really interested in how Black youth, youth of color, and youth of immigrant descent view their identities in relationship with their motivation. But this is especially interesting for Black youth when we consider that in Canada, 94% of Black youth aspire to obtain university degrees, compared to 82% of other non-Black youth who live in Canada. But at the same time, only 60% believe that this is an attainable goal for them, whereas 79% of their non-Black peers perceive that this is an issue for them. So you see that for Black youth, aspirations are, at least this is data pre-pandemic collected shortly before the pandemic from the census. For Black youth, aspiring, high, having really big dreams is not an issue, but there are barriers to believing that this is even possible for them. So I will play. I don't want to know if I would call this a little game, but I have a few questions for you and trying to flesh out a little bit why that might be the case. So I'll just ask you if you've ever heard, if you've ever heard something, and if you have, please raise your hand just so that we can get a feel of what where the room stands. So have you ever heard that Black youth are at risk, that they're like at-risk youth? Okay. Have you ever heard that they're dangerous? Maybe that they're associated with street gangs and street violence? Yeah. Have you ever heard any discourse that says that Black youth are just like all the other youth? Yeah. Or that says that Black youth are a monolith. They all love hip hop and basketball, basically. So if you try to reach them, all you have to do is have hip hop and basketball activities. Yeah. Okay. Thank you. Thank you for indulging. I love cheating my students with those little games like that. I know I'm doing the most. But I was asking you these questions just to give you a little bit of an idea of the narratives that are very prevalent when we think about Black youth. And when I say prevalent, I mean here in Canada and also in the United States, which both have a lot of influence on how Black youth view themselves even over here in Quebec. So, of course, we know that this idea that Black youth are at risk suggests that, they might not be showing resilience a lot of the times, where, of course, Black people are a marginalized community, but as Professor Koestner was just talking about, there's also a lot of post-traumatic growth. People are also showing tremendous strength in a lot of times, but we only hear about the negative side most of the time. There's also sometimes an emphasis on merit, which makes it suggest that some communities who might not reach certain goalposts because they're marginalized are not reaching them because they don't deserve to reach them, right? Because they're not good enough to meet them. We've been also hearing about Black youth being dangerous. So for example, there's really powerful research from Phil Goff and others that shows that Black boys are seen as less childlike as other kids. So they're seen as more intentional in their actions. So if they're making maybe a mistake, if they're doing something that they shouldn't have been doing, they're held as more responsible for their actions compared to other kids. And they're also seen in general as requiring more discipline. So there's a lot of studies from the field of education that shows that for the same type of offense, for the same misbehavior or the same mistake in the classroom, Black kids will be punished more, and they tend to be punished more the first time they do it, rather than other kids. Often the first time they're going to make a mistake like that, it's going to be forgiven for them. And it's maybe only when they get to the second time or the third time that then there's going to face punishment. We tend to see Black youth sometimes as invisible. Some people, they want to say, well, shouldn't we all be treating each other as human? And aren't we all the same profoundly, deep down? And yes, we are in a certain way, but downplaying the differences in experience is also not helpful in hiding a lot of racial inequities and making the experience of Black people and Black youth invisible. And then finally, some people try to overcorrect for that and talk about Black youth like they all have the same needs, when there's really different experiences at different intersections of being Black. So it's really different to be Black and living in the suburb or in a rural area versus in a city. It's really different to be a Black girl, a Black boy, or Black and genderqueer, and so on. So the reason why I'm sharing about all these narratives is because they have a tremendous impact on how Black youth end up viewing their own identities. They basically internalize a lot of these messages, or they react to them in a way where sometimes it makes them feel like certain things are in reach for them, and sometimes certain things still feel like it's out of reach, right? So I just wanted to give a little bit of background on that before jumping in what's going on with the pandemic. Because one thing that's been clear since the pandemic started is that it's tremendously impacted students in schools and how they view themselves in schools. Teachers, overwhelmingly, educators have been reporting that their students are just not as motivated. And so in a context where Black youth already feel like they have these big dreams, these big aspirations, but they're not sure that they can meet them. I was wondering if the pandemic had exacerbated existing challenges in the educational realm for them, particularly in terms of their post-secondary transition, the way that maybe we've seen it have an impact on other realms, right? So I'm asking today and sharing a little bit of data about what's the connection between COVID-19 and post-secondary aspirations for Black youth. And to speak on this, I will pull basically from two projects that I've been conducting. The first one, I have to say, is I'll share mostly quantitative data from this big research partnership we did with a couple of schools on the east side of Montreal. So some of the Black kids are Anglophones, but most of them are Francophones. I think it's like we had about like a 10% who identified as Anglophones in the sample, and we had a pretty big part who identified as allophones, right? Whose first language was, for example, Creole and not English nor French. And the other data that we'll share is more qualitative data from community work that I've been doing in Côte-des-Neiges and NDG, more center west side of the city. So if we jump into the partnership study, some of you may recognize Jean Gros High School in Rivière-des-Prairies and Cégep Marie-Victorin, which is also on the east side. So we're really going to speak about the experience of youth who live in Pointe-aux-Trembles, Montréal-Nord, Rivière-des-Prairies, and around those neighborhoods. So here we surveyed 138 Black youth, a little bit more were high school seniors and then Cégep students, but we selected those groups because, and we surveyed them in winter and spring 2022, so a little over a year ago, because those were the youth whose post-secondary transition were most likely to have been impacted by the pandemic, right? They were probably between third year of high school and 5 year of high school when the pandemic hit. So it hit right at the moment where they would have been making these big decisions to continue to CEGEP and eventually to university or not. And so we surveyed them on all kinds of things, but I just wanted to show you a few highlights today. So we've asked them about the impact that the pandemic has had on them, and particularly on their post-secondary motivation. And what we find is that largely, you know, a lot of them do say that the pandemic has influenced their motivation to engage with post-secondary education. And when we look at their expectations at the time that we surveyed them, what we find is that the ones who do not expect to go to college are more likely to say that the pandemic has influenced their motivation, right? So this suggests that for at least some of them, it looks like maybe the pandemic has reduced their motivation in school and has been hitting them hard. However, what we also find was that when we asked them during the pandemic, I've been able to connect easily to the internet. We find that for most of them, it was the case. However, the ones who expect to attain a college degree, who want to reach college and then who expect that they're able to, they were less likely to say that they were easily connecting to the internet. And similarly, they were more likely to say that the pandemic has had an impact on their family really hard. So this data, I think, is a little bit of data that suggests that the pandemic maybe for some youth has been a discouraging moment in terms of their motivation in school, but for others, maybe who've been facing more financial strain, it's been a moment when it has maybe firmed their resolve to go to college. And I'll get back to that when I talk about the qualitative data. The other thing I wanted to mention, and that I didn't put on the slide to give you a little bit of background, and when you think about those national numbers I presented a little bit earlier, is that in this sample, 67% only, said that they wanted to go to college, whereas 58% said they thought it was attainable for them. So we still saw a drop in terms of the national census data that we had. We can't tell, it's not like a 1-for-1, even though the census data is representative of the country. So we can imagine that there was a drop in the number of youth who wanted to go to college, but we don't know, especially how much was it for these youth specifically. But the qualitative data that I've been collecting also speaks a little bit on that. So you see here pictures from a couple of community centers in Côte-des-Neiges and NDG. So this is why I put the pictures. And what we've been hearing, examples of what youth have been sharing are, for example, that really youth on this other side of the island seem like they've been facing a lot of the similar issues as the ones we surveyed on the east side. So for example, one Black girl was sharing about how she wanted to go to college in order to be rich. That was one of their big life goals. And we asked her, what would being rich look like? And she said, well, it would look like going to the grocery store and be able to buy the food that I want without having to calculate the price. And when we asked, what do you think you're going to study in college for? She was talking about becoming a nurse, right? So this is just an example, I think is a really powerful example. But a lot of kids have been talking about being rich in a way that, I've been doing work with youth and talking about their aspirations and their futures for 15 years. And I've never heard so many kids talk about the desire to become rich. But as you see, rich for them is basically, for a lot of them, is just basically going out of a moment of scarcity, right? I thought something that a Black boy from NDG shared was also really powerful when he was talking about how he wanted to start CEGEP, and then he started going for like the first week, and he hated it because he felt like the CEGEP teachers were really not speaking about his experiences and all the injustice that he saw in the world. And he got really disengaged, and he ended up saying, well, I'm not sure I want to go to CEGEP anymore. I need to go towards people who understand me better. So this gives you a little bit of an idea, but a lot of other youth have been reporting a lot of distress, a lot of disillusion since this pandemic, in a way that we sometimes see, distress in youth, but it didn't used to be the case to that extent before in the studies that I've conducted before in those communities. So we've still seen that a lot of Black youth from these community centers that we've been talking to still have a lot of high aspirations. A lot of them still want to go to college, but then, as I gave as an example, financial concerns seems to be core for them, for many of them. And then another thing that came out is that some of them have really high aspirations and do think they can attain them. So they wouldn't be part of the ones who face that gap that I highlighted at the beginning of the talk. And yet when they talk about what they think is required for them to go to college, they are a little bit disconnected. They basically don't realize that they might not get into college with just any grade, by just continuing to just listen to class, but not really necessarily doing their homework. So there's also a little bit of a disconnect that might have been deepening since the beginning of the pandemic. Perhaps youth have not been socialized in the same way and organized in the same way. At least that's what a lot of teachers say and report to us. So it seems like maybe for that reason, or maybe connected to other reasons, some of them don't feel a lot of gap between what they can attain and what they aspire for, but they seem like there's a disconnect where they might hit reality at some point. So putting all of this together, I think it provides a worrisome picture of some of what Black youth are going through. At the same time, most of them still have high aspirations, which is a solace for me, which is, it seems like they need more support in being able to figure out what they need to attain them. And they need support for barriers to be alleviated so that they can meet those aspirations. And maybe a little bit more encouragement for the ones who got discouraged and distressed over the pandemic. So it's a mixed bag, some concerns, but also some positive aspects, both on the more Francophone side that I described in the quantitative data, and on the Anglophone youth whose interviews I was reporting on. So I'm happy to take questions about this at the end of our symposium, or to talk over lunch and during the break. But before I wrap up, I just wanted to quickly highlight some of my collaborators for this project. Dr. Alicia Botswin-Kite has been spearheading. I was in charge of the quantitative side and a co-investigator, but she's been really spearheading this project about post-secondary transition for Black youth with other professors and community collaborators. Some of my students and other community leaders also have been instrumental in providing incredible support in conducting the interviews I talked about. And finally, I wanted to give a shout out to SHIRK, FRQSA, and McGill, who have funded these two projects. Thank you for listening.
Hi, everybody. So my name is Frank Kachanoff, and I'm an assistant professor at Wilfred, Laurier in Waterloo, Ontario, but I grew up around Montreal and went to school here at McGill. So it's great to be back here and to present some work. So the research I'm going to present is going to be a bit different from what Richard and Régine presented, in that it's mostly data from the US context and not specific to the pandemic per se, but I think could be relevant to some of the issues that are being experienced by us here in Quebec, and especially Black communities in Quebec. So as a roadmap for today's talk, I'm going to start off by talking about this concept of collective autonomy and collective autonomy restriction, which Richard described a little bit in his research. So what is it and why does it matter for our health and well-being? And then the second part of our presentation, I'm going to talk about how this concept can impact both privileged, dominant racial groups and also marginalized, disempowered racial groups, and how we'll fight to challenge racial inequities in society. So to begin, again, what is this concept of collective autonomy and collective autonomy restriction? A starting point of this research is really the idea that a lot of who we are comes from our social groups. So for example, the languages we speak, the names we have, the foods we eat are often connected to social groups that really matter to us. So for example, for me, one of my favorite foods to cook and share with my friends and family is a Moroccan dish called chicken and olives, and I identify in part as Moroccan Canadian. So my mom immigrated to Canada from Morocco, and when I want to share a bit of who I am with the people I care about, I'll make this dish. And when I see something like this in the Montreal Gazette, 6 o'clock solution, Moroccan chicken with lemon and olives, it's a really strong signal to me that at least this part of who I am and my culture is like really accepted in society. I'm free and almost encouraged to share it and practice it. But it's also a reality that we don't always feel this way about our identity and the parts of our identity that are core. So if we think in our Canadian history, the residential schooling system is a systematic attempt to destroy and prevent Indigenous people from expressing core parts of their Indigenous identity. And restrictions to autonomy aren't only a thing of the past, something that we used to do, they can still be present and felt by people today. So we can think of how Bill 21 might impact individuals from expressing important parts of their religious identity, and oftentimes will impact ethnic and religious minorities here in Quebec. And these types of restrictions can be really pervasive, getting at the core of who we are. We think in the US military, if you look at the regulations on how soldiers have to keep their hair, it's especially difficult for Black soldiers to keep their hair natural in order to meet these regulations. So again, thinking of how these things can really strike at the core of who we are. And they're not only tied to race or ethnicity, they also impact us in terms of our gender and sexual identities. So we can think of don't ask, don't tell policies and military organizations that literally told soldiers don't come out about who you are. And then finally, and this is a point that in a way is non-intuitive, but these types of perceptions of restriction can also be experienced or perceived and are subjective things, not necessarily objective things, by members of dominant and privileged groups. So in the US and in Canada, there's been a growing white angst over white identified individuals feeling they're no longer free to express parts of their white identity. This rhetoric was a core part of Donald Trump's campaign in the US, and in some of the qualitative open-ended responses we've seen in our research, we've seen comments, or this is from some of my work, one white American participant saying, if we even try to have a cultural identity, it's considered racist. So again, we can see how these are subjective things and can impact people across the racial hierarchy. And so to try to get at what's the psychology here, me and my collaborators and colleagues have introduced this idea of collective autonomy restriction, which again, we define as our perception that other groups are trying to control how our group defines and expresses our identities. So feeling like I'm not free, and people like me aren't free to act in accordance with who we are as a people. And we've developed a scale to assess these perceptions. So for example, and in the work I'll show today, the starting point is people rating items such as other groups have tried to control what we should value and believe, or other groups have tried to control what customs and practices we should follow. And we can frame these items in terms of any identity that might really matter to people. So that's what collective autonomy restriction is. Why might it matter? And so again, Richard presented some of this work already, but self-determination really spoke to the importance of personal autonomy. So 40 years of research had shown that when we personally feel volitional and able, so as Frank, I can act in terms of who I think Frank is, I'm going to feel more psychological well-being. I'm going to have a better experience in my life. And this work really traditionally looked at restrictions that might impact me as an individual. So do I feel my boss or employer is really trying to control me with a stick and a carrot in my close personal relationships? Do I feel like people are really telling me how I should be versus allowing me to express who I feel I am? But they didn't really think about these types of restrictions I've been talking about so far in terms of those impacting our group. And we know from another important theory in social psychology that, again, because a large part of who we are comes from our groups and our social identities that are core to us, and because we're connected to the people in those groups, we hurt when people like us hurt, right? We can go from we to me, and threats to our social groups can really impact us as individuals. And but this work didn't, again, really look at those types of restrictions to autonomy. And so what we've been trying to do in our work is put these two theories together and argue that because we're so connected to our social groups, we might feel personally controlled if we feel that the freedoms of our groups are being restricted. And I think a really powerful way of thinking of this idea comes from Nelson Mandela, when he talked about his experiences of the oppressive apartheid regime that impact him and his fellow Black South Africans, where he said that freedom is indivisible. The chains on any one of my people were the chains on all of them, and the chains on all of my people were the chains on me. So again, seeing this link between how we feel our groups are able to express who we are and our own personal experiences of autonomy and freedom. And again, kind of putting it all together, because we know that personal autonomy, our own sense of volition and freedom, is important for us feeling good when we perceive and experiences these restrictions to our group. And if that harms our personal autonomy, then that'll take a toll on our well-being. And so a lot of the early work we've been doing in the lab has been testing and providing support for that model. And we've done it in terms of people's ethnic, racial, national, and religious identities across both individualistic and collectivistic cultures. So we didn't just collect data from a North American context, but other countries as well. And we've also shown support for this model, again, in terms of people's gender and sexual identities amongst the LGBTQ+ community. So to give a quick snapshot just of some of that data, I'll present work that we did across free samples amongst the LGBTQ+ community, one in Canada and two that we collected in the United States. And this was an experimental design. So what we did is when people would conduct our survey, we randomly determined whether they would describe a way in which they felt that the autonomy of their community has been supported, where they felt there were ways in which, as a community, they've been free to express and act in accordance with their identity, versus in another condition, writing a narrative about how they lacked that freedom. And what we wanted to see is if people in this restrictive condition would temporarily report less feelings of personal autonomy and well-being, to kind of show the impact of what these group perceptions can mean for people. And we expected that those in the restriction condition would temporarily report less personal autonomy and well-being. And just to give you an idea of what these narratives looked like for people, this is a narrative from a participant in our study that was in the restriction condition, who identified as an asexual, trans girl, and biromantic individual. And they explained that the biggest barrier to collective autonomy for the trans community in Canada is likely the evaluations needed before acquiring hormones. Well, I was lucky and found a counselor quite open to a full spectrum of gender expression, all the way to non-binary status. Many are faced with a pressure to present as near gender stereotypes in order to be given access to HRT. And what's really, I think, powerful about this experience and this narrative is that we can see that the support we receive in our own lives aren't always one and the same as the support we feel our communities and our groups as a whole are receiving. And so while this participant did feel support from their counselor and healthcare providers, they were really aware that not all members of the trans community had that same support. And this work is trying to look at the impact of that perception on people's autonomy and well-being. So how did this kind of writing task impacted how people would personally feel? So again, this is getting at personal autonomy. So we would then ask people, for example, to rate how much they felt I had a lot of pressures that I could do without in my life. So this personal sense of feeling restricted and controlled. And so that's kind of on the y-axis. And then red bars will be those who wrote about this restrictive experience they felt their community had, where the blue bars will be those who wrote about this more supportive experience their community had. And we found that in all our different samples, writing about these restrictive experiences undermined people's own personal sense of autonomy, how they were personally feeling at the time. And then we assessed people's psychological well-being. So did they feel satisfied with their life? Were they feeling emotions of anger and anxiety? And we found that because collective autonomy was diminishing their sense of personal autonomy, in all three samples, we found this then in turn led to diminished psychological well-being. So, kind of applying that to our context here in Quebec and the types of restrictions Richard was showing members of the Black community might be feeling through the COVID-19 pandemic, or because of structural racism and laws such as Bill 96 and Bill 21. I think part of the impact, the negative impact that these things can have on people might in part be due to these how those would impact people's perceptions of their collective autonomy and in turn their well-being. So kind of now shifting gears a little bit, the next kind of part of work we started to do is asking the question, if so much of if collective autonomy is so essential for our own personal needs and our own personal well-being, then will groups fight for power and status when they feel that their collective autonomy is being threatened? And specifically, if you think about, what is power and what is status, we can see how people might believe that these things are important for their group to maintain autonomy. So power really means like, how much resources does a group have? How much power in government does a group have? And what's their potential to influence and also importantly resist the influence of other groups? And interestingly, work has been showing that part of the reason people and groups want power isn't because we want to control and influence others as much as it is because we just want to protect our own autonomy and our own ability to determine our destinies. And then in terms of status, this really refers to Do we feel that our groups are positively seen? Are we seen as moral, competent, worthy individuals in society? And if we feel that other groups see us as immoral or bad or inferior, they might try to change us. And so again, status can be a really important resource for groups to maintain their autonomy and their ability to keep their group identity. And so putting these ideas together, we've begun to propose and develop a model where we can think about how both powerful and disempowered groups might fight for power and status and position within the hierarchy, depending on whether they feel their collective autonomy as a group is being supported and respected and is secure. Where amongst disempowered groups, they might really mobilize even more when they feel their autonomy is being restricted versus tolerating structural inequities and lacking structural power and status if they feel their autonomy is secure. And then on the flip side, for powerful groups, they might really want to cling on to power and really might shy away from acknowledging transgressions and privileges that in their mind might threaten the moral status of their group if they feel their autonomy is at threat, versus being willing to have these challenging conversations when they feel secure. So, and then we can apply this model to think about how these perceptions are important for whether groups are going to engage in moving for social justice and social equity. So we've done work amongst Black community samples where we found and tried to test, does restriction predict people's engagement in collective action, even accounting for other forms of perceived discrimination and racial inequity that they might be experiencing? And we find that indeed it does. Controlling for these things, it predicts community members' support for collective action. And again, we can think of how these things might be impacting how groups are going to mobilize in a Quebec context. And then finally, just to wrap up, but I think really important work is that this also applies to the role that white identified and dominant racial groups are going to play in fighting for racial justice. So beyond trying to not be racist in our attitudes and the way we behave, an important part of fighting against racism is fighting the structural side of racism, doing the work necessary to change the social systems in which there's inequities for different racial groups. And while this kind of movement and talk has increased since 2020 into George Floyd protests, and here's an example of an anti-racism tool that was shared in this big tech community company called Basecamp, it can also be polarizing. So after workers had shared this to try and think of the structural role and types of racism and how they play a role in that in the organization, this kind of conversation was banned from that organization completely. Any talk of race or politics was banned. And so what we wanted to do in our study is assess people, white identified Americans' level of collective autonomy restriction. And then a week later, we had them with 3 or 4 other white identified individuals. Imagine they were in a company very similar to Basecamp, where they were given and asked to apply this important yet challenging anti-racism teaching tool and have a conversation imagining they were in a company like Basecamp. And we coded what people said. Did they engage with these conversations in a critical way, think about what role they play in fighting against structural racism, or did they see this as threatening and push back against these types of anti-racism trainings and organizations? And so we coded for this type of behavioral engagement. And then using statistics, we could see both did my own sense of collective autonomy thread a week earlier, and also independently, the people I was talking to in my group, how did that predict what I was going to say and how I was going to act in this conversation? And we found that both my own sense of restriction a week earlier and that of my partners, assessed independently, were detrimental to me trying to engage in these conversations and being motivated afterwards to engage in anti-racism. And so again, I think this work is important because it's essential, I think, for everyone to play their part in fighting against structural inequities, especially those who identify racial groups who have enjoyed the privileges of racial inequities. And this type of restriction might be one barrier to that. And so in our ongoing work, we're trying to think of ways to kind of have white identified folks feel comfortable about their autonomy and kind of reframe their identity in a way that's accordant with fighting against racial injustices so they can engage in these conversations. So with that, I'll say thank you to all the amazing collaborators who've helped me with this work and to SSHRC for funding this research.
Thank you all very much. I've been advised that there's an advisory group that has to have their lunch quickly because they're going to meet some other people. So I would invite that group to leave now. And for the rest of you, we could stay another 5 minutes and answer any questions you have.
My name is Anna. I'm with Canadian Heritage. I'm a research and policy analyst with the Action Plan for Official Languages. Thank you very much for your presentation. So I work with a lot of policymaking. And my question is actually for you, Régine. Thank you so much for your presentation. You mentioned high aspirations. You also mentioned that sometimes there is a disconnect between the youth, what they want, and how they can get to that goal. And as a minority in the public service, I have this conversation often with my colleagues and higher ups too. You know, when you don't have a role model within the public service, it's much harder to get up and you're in a circus in your head, not knowing what to do. Whereas people who work in Gatineau, Ottawa, for instance, they're at 70% or 80% likely to have someone in the public service already who may be able to guide their career. So I saw a link between what you were saying and this experience, for instance. And I was wondering, not necessarily for official languages only, but from a broader sense, how can policymaking bring this degree of equity required? Because policies, if applied equally to everyone, will keep on feeding these gaps that already exist. So in terms of equity, knowing you have worked with youth, minority youth also, what kind of advice or policy ideas would you have to mitigate these lackings to level the field? Thank you.
Thank you for this question. It's a really good question. And I think if I understand what you're saying, right, is like, if we don't take action, the problem will perpetuate itself because people feel like they don't have the type of models that would inspire them to think that they can achieve certain aspirations. And then we'd have this vicious circle.
Who will fill the gaps of lack of knowledge that may not be provided already within your immediate circle, right? Like parents who have gone to university, or parents who have who work in the public service. To give just an example to illustrate. Yeah, so like equity seeking public make.
Well, in terms of there were a lot of parts to your question. I hope I catch at least some of them. But in terms of at least two things. In terms, first of all, of the question about the role models and the lack of models, there's a really, really powerful study from Denehi and Dasgupta in PNAS, the Proceedings of the National Academy of Science, published a few years ago. That and it was a study that focused on experiences of women in engineering. And if my memory is correct, what happened was they randomly assigned female students who were engineering students, I think maybe first year or, at the beginning of their entrance in college. And they randomly assigned them to either have no mentor, have a man who was a mentor, or have a woman who was a mentor. And all the mentors were engineers who were a bit further down the career path. And what they found was that being assigned a mentor was really helpful to understand how engineering works, to having good grades, and succeeding in engineering. But only the female students who got a woman who was a mentor felt like they could belong in engineering as a field and then keep going. So I think that study is one of the most powerful ones that I've seen, but there are other ones that suggest that having mentors and having role models, even if you don't talk to them, to see people who are succeeding, who are a little bit like you, can be really, really powerful. And to be able to amplify the work of those people and put them in contact with others can be one way that we can start reaching more numbers, higher numbers. I think in some of my own work with youth, I also work on preparing them and discussing really openly about some of the discrimination they will face and about some of the obstacles that everybody faces when they want to go to college. So a part of the process might also involve discussing the challenges that everybody faces, but that maybe if you're part of a community who's underrepresented in a certain field or in a certain workplace, you might start to wonder, well, do I feel challenged by, let's say these equations because my group were not known for being really strong at math, or is it because everybody struggles with these equations because they're just so hard, and what I need to do is just get more support. So that's some of what the work I've been doing, and I know other identity and motivation researchers have been doing with youth to help fill the gap. So I could imagine that you could have a parallel level of conversation with people in the public sector, and I think, more largely, beyond just putting the onus on people who are from stigmatized and marginalized groups to succeed, there really needs to be some more systemic approaches to policy change where you could start looking into what are the barriers to certain groups succeeding in our organization. Why do they not feel that they can do well in our field? And sometimes it has to do because some of the values or some of the norms to succeed are not aligned with theirs, but what they have to bring could work just as well, and they would be just as competent, but they would just take a path that's slightly different than what is showed a lot of the time. So having these clear messages that what they have to bring is valued, and not only making a narrative or a message, but really taking concrete action so that the actions match the word, I think could also be really powerful. And more largely as a society, we need to address more globally those different narratives about different groups that put people in more restrictive boxes where we expect only a few things from them rather than the range of human experience that are shaped by whatever ethnicity, race, gender, level of ability they have. But we just need to see them a little bit more fully rather than being guided by these harmful narratives. I feel like that's a lot of different steps. I hope some of them were concrete enough to help.